Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are literally at the last line. We finished the last line on page 1460. The Rebbe Rashab has returned to the theme that he was addressing on page 1459. And that is that in addition to the thirst and longing, what he calls the rotzei, teikef harotzei, the intense longing and yearning and thirst that a neshama has when it's shcherani, when it's down below and darkened and everything is concealed in a desolate and arid midbar, desert. So in addition to that midbar de kedusha, meaning that deep thirst that longs and reaches levels that are higher than smicha, than growth and giluyim and revelations, it also comes to recognize and appreciate that even the higher levels, even the levels of revelations, like he says specifically, all the higher worlds and all the revelations, they too, compared to Atzmus, compared to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God, are a state of inanimate emptiness, as he calls it. Compared to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So to explain that line, the Rebbe Rashab has gone into a longer parenthesis that begins in the early part of the paragraph on page 1460 and will conclude around halfway down, a little more than halfway down, 1461. That's what we're in the middle of. How can you make such a statement? That's a very powerful statement. It's a very radical statement, I should say. To say all the il misalyenim and all the giluyim are ein b'hem chayis klal, like daimon, like a midbar. Because on their own, they're rich and saturated with Gilui Elikus and of high levels, very high levels of Gilui Elikus. We talked about B'nai Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, total dveikus, bitlu mitzias, everything that we learned about. And yet, compared to the core source of it all, Atzmus, the Eibishter, is considered lifeless. So he began to explain, and I'll sum up what we learned in the parentheses. Yesh levayazeh, according to what it says elsewhere on the statement Vashem Elokim Emes, Hu Elokim Chayim. The Mashu Emes Zeh B'chinas Chayim. What is true life? When you say something is life, something is lifeless, what does that mean? So yes, no one's saying that the Giluyim and Elikus don't have life in them. But we have to define what life is. So this statement is saying that only something that's absolute truth is absolute life. So briefly, what did we learn? That mitis inyan achayim hu shechai be'etzem. True life, not just life. True life is chai be'etzem, means that the life is generated from within that very reality itself. If something else is giving it life, even if it comes alive in the fullest sense of the word, but it's not coming from within itself, it's not chai be'etzem. And then he goes on to explain that both the body and even the soul are not chai be'etzem in that way, because both of them result from something else giving them life. Body results very clearly. A body is inanimate. And the soul gives it life. It's true, it gives it life that it becomes one with it, that the body is not like just an inanimate stone where you are moving it around, but it itself is not alive. The body is alive, but its life force is coming from the neshama. And when the neshama leaves, the body is no longer alive. Yeah. But even more than that, even the nefesh is a nefesh chaya. It's a living soul. The soul is the source of life, that we have life, the soul within the body. So you would think the nefesh is chay, the chayusi chayes atzmi. He calls it chayes atzmi. Never, because the soul is eternal. The body is perishable. The body is subject to the changes of age and deterioration and ultimately perishing. The soul is not subject. The soul is an neshama nitzchis. It's an eternal soul. It's chai v'kaim le'ilam. And as the pasuk says, "Atam adveikim Hashem elokeichem chaim kol chamayim." However, it's on the condition because the soul is an extension of godliness, not because the soul has its own independent power. It's true, it's a living soul, but it's dependent on because it's kosher v'davuk to the source of life, which is the Eibishter. Chayusa v'kiyuma einu mitzad atzma, kiyim shetoli ba'atzmus, dependent on Atzmus. And by being bound to Ein Sof, that's why the neshama is an itzchi. So yes, it's more alive than the body in the sense, because it's eternal, but it's still dependent on the source of the neshama. And in general, he says that's because the Ratzon HaBeida, because the Eibishter wanted the neshama, wanted that chaim of the kiyum of the neshama should be eternal. So again, it's still dependent on the Eibishter. Im kein ein ze amitis achayis. So you can't call it true life because it's not really generated completely from within itself. When you say it's not true, remember, he's not saying it's false life. He's not saying it's superficial life. He's not saying it's an illusion. Just saying truth. When you want to really understand what is absolute, you have to, these are the levels. Absolute has to be generated from within. I want to just elaborate a bit on that before we go to the next page, just to give an example, somewhat of an example. Not a perfect example, but I think it could help drive the point home. I remember I was once invited to speak Le'aleinu, no one should know, at a shleishim. It was a shleishim, someone had passed away. They were on the Upper West Side. And as I was being driven on the West Side Highway, I was thinking what I'm going to say. And often what I do is I look out the window and I pick up things. And I saw a billboard. There's a billboard there, an advertisement for Newport cigarettes. So you had this a beautiful couple, most handsome, most alluring couple. Their faces were shining, their teeth were as white, as perfectly white as it could be. A big billboard on the West Side Highway, I remember on the right side of the highway. And then it said on top, "Alive with pleasure." And then Newport. And of course, the prerequisite box that has to be able to be read from the road, from the highway, that said smoking kills, carbon. I remember all the very frightening and foreboding warning about what smoking does, which is just another irony of our world, that the same people are paying millions, billions of dollars for this advertising. I tell you, it kills you. And yet it's a beautiful image. And they knew psychologically what effect it would have. So I had my topic that I would speak about. And I said that. I said, what is life? Newport cigarettes and other marketers would have us believe that this couple are alive with pleasure, not just alive, with pleasure. And you look at their faces, who doesn't want to look like that? But is that real? They don't give you a picture of what their teeth really look like if they're smokers, or what the x-rays look, or their lungs look like if you took an x-ray of them. They're creating an image of what they think is life and life with pleasure. The week was Parsha Chayei Sarah, actually. So I contrasted that and I said, and Chayei Sarah, the name of the chapter is the life of Sarah. But the whole chapter talks about her death. Even that first verse can be misleading. You read the life of Sarah and then you continue reading the same verse. It says the life of Sarah, she lived 127 years, 127 years. So it's not telling her about her life, it's telling her about the end of her life. And yet the Torah calls it Chayei Sarah. You want to dedicate a chapter to the life of Sarah, it was the previous chapter that we talked about her physical life. And the answer is because the Torah is telling us what is true life. Same thing by Yaakov, by the way. Chapter by Yaakov. Yaakov lived. It also tells us that he lived 147 years and passed away. It's not this chapter about his life, it's a chapter about his death, actually. His life is covered in previous chapters. The Torah is telling us what is true life. A doctor will tell you true life is biological life. Person is breathing, their brain is functioning, their heart is beating. Whatever the vital signs are that define medically and biological life. So that's life in the sense of a breathing entity. The Torah is telling us what is true life, a life of meaning, a purpose, a legacy. You want to know when someone's truly alive? You don't look at when they were walking on this earth, because then they're obviously alive. You look at what effect they had on their families and on people once they're physically gone. Then you see they're really alive. We can talk about Sarah now, thousands of years later. That's called alive. There are many people in their lifetime were very powerful, but as soon as they died, everybody wanted to forget them or forgot them. So it says, Tzaddikim, even in their lifetimes, even in their deaths, they're called alive. And Rashayim, wicked people, even in their lifetimes, they're called dead. Because dead and alive is not just biological. It's about things that are deeper than that. Just to give an example, so we wouldn't say that a person who's biologically alive is physically not alive. We'd say it's limited. It's a life that's more on a surface level, on a superficial level, a biological level. But if you want to know what is amitis hachayim, true living and true life, you have to think in more of a spiritual context. Here he's going even deeper. Not just the neshama, a life of neshama, but also a life coming from Atzmus, the source of the neshama as well. Just to give a little context to understanding that you could define life in many ways. And the Torah, and here in Ayin Beis, he wants to define the ultimate life. You want to connect to the ultimate life. Why would I want to connect to to so-called a pipeline coming from the main source when I can connect straight to the source, which is where we're going to lead to in this discussion. So with that, I'm ready to continue on the top of page 1461. And this is all coming to teach what midbar de Kedusha is, the awareness and cognizance that we achieve down here, lamata, with shcheirani. It's only we're in the dark world that we can come to this understanding. Because if you're living basking in the glow of Ziva Shechina and divine glory, you're not going to sense this. You're going to sense the closeness. You're going to sense the pleasure that one is gaining, the spiritual pleasure. And here we're talking about understanding that all of that is considered lifeless compared to the source of life, Atzmus. So now that he gave the example of the body and the soul, he's going to go back now how it is Lamaila in the Elam Esalyanim and the Giluim. In case somebody has any question, let's stop for questions if there are any, and then I'll continue. So, top of page 1461, pages can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. So after saying Ein Zamitis Achayis, talking about the nefesh, the neshama, even the neshama lakis, the divine soul, he says, Ukamoy Kein Yuvan, just as we just explained, first with the body and even more with the soul, Ukamoy Kein Yuvan mizeh hadugma lamayla. That was an example. Now, from this, we'll understand as an example of how it's above, the Eidos v'Keilim. The Eidos v'Keilim, the energies and containers that God created, or God placed into Seder Ishtalshus, and Atzilus, and the other worlds. He's talking, I see Atzilus. Sha'Keilim d'Atzilus, hem b'chinas elikus mamash. That's a given. Even the containers of Atzilus are mamash elikus, like he said, even on the top of the previous page, that they're not yesh ma'ayin mamish. He said the Keilim are Atzilus, they're divine, they're divine identity. Let's say the Keilim of Chesed of Atzilus. So it's Chesed, it's God's Chesed, but it's Chesed, but it's God's Chesed. It's totally and utterly and absolutely a divine flow of divine kindness, divine love. The same thing with Gvura, the same thing with Tiferes, same thing with Chachma, with Bina. So the Keilim are mamash alakus. Just like he said before with the body, that the body is mamish alive. The soul is vitalizing and energizing the very body. But nevertheless, like we spoke about the body in the example, they're not dveikus b'mekayim. The Keilim focus on the attribute called chesed. So though they're completely elikus, there's no other chesed except God's chesed, but they're not actively, as we're going to learn about Oyer, attached, meaning actively feeling and sensing the bittul that Oyers feel to the source, because their role is to create the parameters of chesed. Yes, chesed of God, godly chesed, but still it's not dveikus b'mekayim is the expression used. Sometimes Chassidus use the word dvekus ein nikeres. That in the keli you don't see the direct, so-called like the direct the attachment of the pipe to its source. You see a lakus, but you don't see a live flow. Or the mishum zen that solo v'chinas mitzias davar, and because of that, they emanated or they were imparted. Remember the word net solo. They emanated as a mitzias davar. It's called chesed. Higher than Atzilus, especially before the Tzimtzum, you can't even call it a mitzias davar. There's no Keilim there. Here it's a mitzias davar. Take an example, for instance. Let's go to the example I often use, the example of the pregnancy, the fetus. So before you actually see any distinction between limbs and organs, it's all one cell. Before that, you only have a neshama. Before conception, there's only a soul. So once you have a body, even though the body is nothing but a vehicle for the soul, because remember, the child hasn't become a separate entity yet after birth, but it's still a mitzias davar. There's now something to hold on to. So in Atzilus, you have Keilim. I know it's not a perfect example because in Atzilus, we also spoke about Ibur and Leda. Just trying to distinguish where something could be completely connected to its source, but it's not called dvekus, because there's a mitzias davar now. There's some entity here. V'nikra b'shem gufim. And these Keilim are called in the name of bodies. They're called bodily entities. Obviously not physical bodies, means spiritual bodies, but it's bodies, gufim. He actually brought that earlier as well when he said gufim b'lei nishmasa. What was the expression there? Yeah. Just a second, I want to see how he brought it earlier. Yeah, at the end of the paragraph on page, the middle paragraph on page 1459. Okay, so they're called gufim. And you established a number of gufim. These are Keilim. We say this in Pasuk Eliyahu. So he's comparing it to Keilim. And being that they're entities like that, containers, vessels, so where's their energy coming from? This is chesed of Atzilus, is chesed of Hashem, God's chesed. But being that like a keli, it's the keli of the chesed. So where's it getting its chayes from? It's coming mina oir. Ukamaimer. Like again, the statement in the Zohar, V'ahu neviu iu kenishmasa legufa. And that which flows into them, like the water that flows into them, is the energy is like a soul in a body. So you see here that the Oros and Keilim of Atzilus are compared to soul and body. So therefore, the example he gave at the bottom of the last page, very appropriate. It is an example from the body and soul down on earth, but still, the Oros and Keilim are called Neshamas Begufa, Nishmasa Legufa. So what do you say? So the vitality and the revelation of the containers, humina er, is coming from the earth. It's not coming from itself. So as much as it's divine, but its energy is flowing from the earth, just like a body is alive, but its energy is coming from the soul. The kad ant histalik menayu, and when that energy is mistalik, is removed from it, or leaves it, what happens? Ishtaru kulo shman kegufa b'lei nishmasa. They all remain empty like a body without a soul. The shman could also be the shemus, like names. Kegufa b'lei nishmasa, which he quoted, as I said earlier, on page 1459 as well. The hainu b'bchinas helen bilvad, which means that the gilui is gone. So it's only a state of hell and only concealment, because all you have left is an inanimate keli. So if the earth leaves the keli, it's like the neshama that leaves the body. So you have a keli, but it's helen bluvad. It says elsewhere, explained elsewhere. So that's the first part. So you can't call the Keli Chayes Amiti, because its Chayes is coming from the Oir, like the body is getting its life and energy from the soul. Now he's going to go to the next part. Just like the Neshama too, even though it's a Chayes Atzmi, and it's Dveikus to Hashem, and therefore it's eternal, but still the Oir, like the Neshama, is also not Amitis Achayes because it's coming from the source. That's going to be now the next section. So he's literally, in a very, very organized and eloquent way, gave an example on the bottom of last page, and now applying that to the Eiris and Keilim Lamaila to show us that all of it is not true life compared to the source itself, Atzmus. So now he continued with Eir. But let me stop if anybody has any question about what we just read and learned about the Keilim of Atzilus. Omnom, however, Gamba Eir, Shobchinis Dveikus Bimkede. What about the Eir? The Eir is Dveikus. The Keilim are not Dveikus Bimkede. They're not the lifeline itself. They're recipients of the energy, just like a body receives the energy of the soul. The Eir, on the other hand, is Dveikus Bimkede. The Eir is attached. The Eir is a direct pipeline, a direct channel. That's what Eir is. Eir is a channel from the Moir. So when you have like sunlight from the sun, it's not the particles, it's not the sunlight as it's manifesting in a certain identity. It's the very light itself that's Dveikus, that's attached to its source. And they're in a state, the Eir, in a Chai Be'etzem, because they're not receiving it, they themselves are alive. Nevertheless, even there, that is Dveikus, it's still not self-generated. Once it's there and God put it there, it itself is alive, in contrast to the body that is receiving life. But it's not Mitzad Atzmi. It's not that the Eir has now assumed properties that it could be independent from the Etzem. It's because it's attached to the Etzem. That's what gives it that type of Chai Be'etzem. If the light forever, God forbid, would lose its connection to its source, imagine, for example, the sunlight was suddenly severed from the sun. It would lose all its power. It would cease to be. There would be no light if whatever would block between the sun and the sunlight. So once there's no Dveikus, the Eir loses that. When there's Dveikus, it has a Chai Be'etzem. In other words, in a more internalized way than Keilim. But it's still not Mitzad Atzmi. It's through the Dveikus Be'etzem, exactly like you said before about the soul. U'ba'ad Dveikus Be'etzem, harihu b'chinas Chai Be'etzem. And in its Dveikus, in its attachment to the core, that's what causes it to be Chai Be'etzem. So its attachment is so deep that it is like an extension of the Atzmius, the core energy from the source. But it's coming from the source. Okay. Now the next line. The Kamoi Kain who Gamba HaKeilim. Okay, the Rebbe Rashab is adding something now, which as always usually makes things more complicated. But he's saying the truth is that this also now spills over into the Keilim. That the Keilim of Atzilus are also called at times Chai Be'etzem. Because it's Keilim of Atzilus. So then what's the difference? The difference is the Keilim receive it from the Eir. The Eir receives it from the Etzem. The Keilim also have a connection to the Etzem. That's why I say Iyu v'garmu hichad. So he's not distinguishing here, but it's very clear that just like with a body and a soul, that the body itself is alive, though the body is mortal, there's something that's completely seamlessly connected to the body. Even more so in Atzilus, the Keilim themselves become Chai Be'etzem of Elikus, but they're still not Dveikus. The Keilim themselves don't feel that direct connection. They are that way, but it's because the Chayis has lifted them up to that level, where the Eiris are constantly aware of their connection. He doesn't say that here explicitly, but in other places, that's how it's explained. But he just wanted to qualify that Keilim of Atzilus are not mortal in a way. Yes, they're left like Gufa B'lei Nishmasa, like a body without a soul, but they don't decompose. In a physical body, it actually decomposes. The Keilim of Atzilus will not decompose. They just won't be alive, meaning with the vitality of the Ohros, because they're Keilim of Atzilus. They're Ruchnistic entities at the end of the day. So he's not really, as I said, spelling it out, but the fact that he says Kamoy Kein Gamba Keilim, because he wants to qualify that the Keilim also have an element of it, but it's quite like the Ohros. But regardless, he's now established that both the Ohros and Keilim are both not Chai Be'etzem Etzem. It's Chai Be'etzem Be'poel, but it's coming because of its connection to its source by the Ohros. Okay, I'll pause here for any questions. And we'll continue. He's going to go back now to the Neshamas. How about Neshamas? Yeah, okay.
Is this a good point? Easy to repeat. You probably said it, I don't remember. What that means?
It means it doesn't have it of its own. It means that God infused the soul with a piece of himself.
It's sort of a different way. Okay. Okay.
It's only because the soul is a piece of godliness that it has that type of power. It's not on its own.
Thank you.
Rabbi Jacobson, didn't we also say in the past that a different volume, maybe even we're beginning, that the source of the Keilim was the Keilim Be'etzem, ultimately speaking. So how can we say? Go ahead.
So that's also. So first of all, it's coming from Helam Atzmi. It's not its own. It's also coming from somewhere. It's not its own entity. Secondly, that state of Helam, if you're talking about, however, the vitality of the Keilim, to be alive, functioning Chesed, needs Or. That's just the fact that there is a Keilim. God can create a container for Chesed. That's coming from the Helam Atzmi. So number one, it's also coming from a source. And number two, it's not alive. It's not a functioning Chesed at that point. It's just simply, you have a Keilim. Now you need the Neshama, the Or, to give it vitality. And that Chayis is also not coming from itself. Either way, it's not coming from itself. Nothing creates itself. Nothing energizes itself. Everything is getting it from a higher place. Okay? V'cheinu gam b'neshamas, and so too is it with souls. U'kamosh kosav, like it says, hu kayam, he is forever. Kayam meaning sustains forever. U'neshmoi kayam, and his name is lasts forever. Kayam, preserved, or perpetuates, if you wish. V'kisei nochen, and his throne is established. So he's going to explain what are these three expressions in the verse. It says, hu kayim, hu is bechinas ha'atzmus. That's calling Atzmus. Atzmus is kayim, forever and ever. He's, like he said, chai be'etzem in the ultimate sense of the word, everything, the ultimate truth of what real existence is. True reality. That's who, kayim. Ushmoi v'kisei hu b'chinas ha'oir v'hanashamis. And the other two expressions, that shmoi kayim, is going on the oir, and kisei hanashamis, shehem gam ken b'chinas chai v'kayim be'etzem. They too are kayim and nochin. They too last. But all this is not on their own. Is because they're attached to and they're receiving that perpetual, or you can say eternal power from the etzem. So it's just now put it into more words and more language. Interestingly, he doesn't use kisei and calls it kelim, he calls it neshamas. But we learned earlier that neshamas and kelim have somewhat of a connection because the neshamas are rooted in the highest places, but they travel through the kelim. He didn't say it explicitly, but it could be that's why it's interchangeable a bit.
Did you skip a line or is it me?
I'm looking now. I don't think I skipped a line. No, I didn't skip a line. I'll read it again. I'll say like this. It says, "V'cheinu gam b'neshamas k'mo shekasav hu kayim v'shmoi kayim v'kisei nochen hu kayim u'b'chinas ha'atzmus v'shmoi v'kisei u'b'chinas ha'er v'aneshama shem gam keim b'chinas chai v'kayim b'etzem." They too are alive and eternal, the kayim, and eternally lasting. Avol, however, kol ze'einu mitzvehem mitzad atzmo. But all this is not something they have on their own. It's only due ki mitzad, due to advekus ba'etzem. Their connection, their attachment, their cleaving to the core source. So, for example, if you had a source of energy, a source of electricity that has an infinite amount of electricity to generate, and then it generates a flow of an electric current. So the electric current will also be infinite because it's coming from an infinite source. But that's not because on its own it has that. It's because it's an extension of, and it's connected to its source. Disconnected from its source, and it will lose that energy. Ubederech klal, he's going back to the line he said before in the bottom of last page, he's repeating. Because dveikus be'etzem means it sounds like it's almost natural. Once the oil is connected to the source, it flows. But the Rebbe Rashab wants to make one more step to make sure that it's not on its own, because there you could still say, you're right, it's not the source, but as long as it's attached to the source, it will continue to flow. But there's one more point. In general, this is due to Ratzna Atzmus. It's not like oil connected to Atzmus and automatically will flow. It's because Atzmus wants it to be connected and wants it to extend and express the divine, infinite, eternal power. When it comes to like electricity, once you're connected, there's nothing that can stop the flow from flowing. Because there's no Ratzna. It's like the sunlight and the sun. The sun doesn't have a choice. The sun was created to give off light. The sun can't choose one day, I'm not giving off light. But when it comes to Atzmus, the disconnect is the distance is even more so. Not only is the chayis of the oil coming because of its connection, it's also comes, God wants it to come from its connection. He wants the connection and wants it to flow. Ratzon habeira. Sarotzana Atzmus. Liyas bechinas v'gili min ha'etzem. That rotzen, the desire that God wants, that there should be this level of er and gili, of light and revelation from the core. Hainu bechinas dveikus ba'etzem. That's what Eibishter wants. That there should be such an entity that should come from the core, which means that it's attached to the core, and that's where it's receiving its eternal power. Basically, we're saying here is that the true reality of Atzmus is beyond Keilim, beyond beyond all the worlds. But then God chose to manifest different aspects of himself in these different channels. He gave the power to manifest eternity, eternal spirituality, the eternal soul in the neshamas. In Keilim, he gave also a certain element of eternity, but not on its own. It's receiving it from the the vitality part. That very Keilim, you mentioned correctly, comes from Helam Atzmus. But it's all coming from a higher level. So in other words, the true reality is not, we shouldn't be deceived into thinking that Oros and Keilim are the source of the source. They are in the Mitzias Nimtza, in the existence as we know it. God placed channels, so to speak, tracks that manifest his presence in different ways. So therefore, when you really contemplate on that, you come to realize that everything is lifeless except Atzmus, as he began this whole topic. Any questions? Oh, I should finish the last sentence here, the last statement, because it's relevant. The this is the element. And if his desire was not to radiate, if he did not want to shine through Eir, there will not be Gilead. So this is in addition to the fact that even once there is Eir, it's only due to its connection to the source. But even more than that, if the source didn't want it, there wouldn't be such an existence. To show you again how the only reality is Atzmus itself. Im kein hari mitzias eir v'kiyumi ein mitzad atzmei shel ha'eir ki mitzad atzmus. So based on that, even when the eir exists, its existence and its perpetuation, kiyum, its eternal kiyum, ein mitzad atzmei. It's not due to itself. It's only due to Atzmus. So both the existence of it and also its continual perpetuation is only mitzad Atzmus, not mitzad itself. Valkain. So what do we conclude from all this? Amitis achayis, true life, hubchinis Atzmus, is Atzmus alone. Shu emes mitzad atzmei. Like we said before, Elikim emes, because he is true on his own. He's true from within. The only true reality from within, not something that caused it to be true. Something that was put there, that was placed there, that was willed to be there. This is mitzad atzmei. Rambam, like the Rambam writes, b'tchilosei, in the beginning of Mishnah Torah, Yad HaChazaka, what's the first opening there? In the Hilchos Yiseda Torah, Hu Sha'amar HaNovi, that this is what the Novi says the Rambam. This is what the prophet says, V'Hashem Elikim Emes. I think is the third halacha maybe. He begins, you say this, V'Amud HaChalpos, that Kol HaNimtzoyim Nimtzoyim Amitis Himotzei, from a Motzei Rishon, everything comes from the source. But then he says, this is what the Navi says, Hashem Elikim Emes. That God is Emes. She'ein la'acher Emes kamitosi is Baruch, says the Rambam. There's no other entity that has the truth like the truth of God. So things can have a truth because God gave it truth, or was created in a truthful way. But the truth of God, nothing is like the truth of Amitashi is Baruch. The Rambam continues, because everything needs him, and he does not need them. Not a two-way street. Everything is dependent on Atzmus, on the source, and the source is not dependent on them. That's why he's Amitis Emes. That's called true Emes. The Kol Mashanimtza, because everything that exists, Hakol Hisavuse v'Kiyume, everything, its creation, its very coming into being, the Kiyume, and its perpetuation. In other words, not just its creation, but that it continues to be. Who Mi'ite is Baruch, is from him, is from God, from him, meaning from God, blessed be he. Yisbarach. For who Yisbarach mitziyuse matzmuse? This is expression brought in Tanya Gersa Kedesh 20. It also comes from, well, it's the Lashon of the Tanya. Who Yisbarach mitziyuse? His existence is from where? Everything exists from something. His existence is from within himself. Matzmuse. Shezeu amitzius amiti. This is true reality. This is what we call the Metzias built in Metzias Nimtza, it's not an existence that you can call existence as we know existence. Something we've discussed a number of times. So he's using here terms that are exclusively Atzmus terms. I pointed out many times when he says Atzmus, it could be Atzmus ha'oyer. It could be many levels. But when you talk on this level, now we're going literally, the only exclusively Atzmus is Mitziuse Matzmuse. It's the only existence that comes from within himself. Everything else comes from the source before it. And what kind of existence is that? Nothing exists like that. You know, when atheists ask the question, you say nothing can create itself. And then who created God then? And the mistake is because God is not like anything else. You have to say the first source was not created because he is self-generated. His truth is not dependent on something else. And then you say, one second. So then it's not like anything else in existence. Everything else in existence is not like that. That's why one of the reasons we call it Metzias built to Metzias Nimtza, which means you can't say it doesn't exist, but you can't say it exists like this table exists or like Atzilus exists. So we call it Metzias Eine B'chinas Metzias Nimtza, which means it exists, but not in an existential existence as we understand existence. So it's essentially saying it does not exist. But we can't call it existence as we know it based on our parameters and definitions of existence. So when you say God is invisible, you'll say, well, one second, I can see this table, I can see a chair, I can see you. Why can't I see God? Because God is not in existence like any other existence. You know, by us existence, if you don't see it, it's not there. I shouldn't say that exactly. It could be something that's not near you. But if it's not present in some way, where someone can experience it, we call it non-existent. With Atzmus, that doesn't work that way. It doesn't have to fit into our instruments and our tools because it doesn't exist on the same terms that we exist. That's why he's God. So that's what he's saying here. So this is a different reality, a completely different reality. Compared to that, the highest levels of Oyer is equal to the lowest levels of a Yesh. Because he didn't say this, but I'm just saying it because you're dealing with something that is infinitely beyond infinitely apart from everything. So he's going back to Emes and Chayis. Remember Emes and Chayim. The expression Hashem Elokim Emes, Hu Elokim Chayim. Because he's such a true reality, that's why he's also true life. Shu Chay v'Kayim be'etzem amitoseh. That's called true existence, true life. The Chay, living, and Kayim, and perpetuating be'etzem amitoseh, in the core of what reality and truth is, absolute truth. That's how he began the parentheses. That this is Hu Elokim Emes, that the God is that so absolute truth. He's also absolute life. He's referring us to look about all of this, but at length, in a mimer called the Dibra Maslu B'Yem Simchaschem, says here Reish Nun Zayin, but below they mark it's Reish Nun Vav. So it's a famous mimer from the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab said years earlier, this is we're now Tafresh Ayin Beis, and later this Tafresh Nun Vav. So there, we look there, he elaborates on this point. But essentially, that's the summation of it. And then one more line for this parentheses. And this now explains the line. Remember, before the parentheses, the line was that all the worlds and all the Giluyim are like daimim, are inanimate. Ein bem chayis klal, he said. L'gaba kodesh baruch hu. He says, this is the explanation that we just gave. That's the parentheses began, v'yesh levayer. He's explaining, how could you call them lifeless? So he says, that all the worlds and all the revelations, they're like lifeless, inanimate matter, an inanimate entity, mineral, legaba atzmus, compared to atzmus. Because they have no chayes atzmi, they have no true core life of their own. Everything they have is coming from the source. And that concludes this parenthesis. That explains this idea. And now he's going to go back to what he began saying, that Midbar leads to Riyah from the Zohar. Midbar the Kedusha, because it's leading us to this awareness, this type of cognizance and Riyah, vision and clarity about what is true reality. So we're going to get back to that shortly, but I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. Very powerful parentheses. Very good stuff here. Wow.
Amazing. So Hashem energy is the only thing that happens that emerges from itself. Like it, if you can
I wouldn't call
speak
it
that,
energy.
or
It's-
whatever.
It's basically understanding. I mean, look, it's coming to understand that reality. I mean, even from a logical point of view, through a process of elimination, you have to come to understand that the source of everything is unlike everything that comes from it.
Right.
Or else we're just subject to back to the same original question: what created that source?
Right.
So you have to come to that conclusion. You know, it's like the joke when the Keilim, when the guy in Keilim, they lived, it was a small town, and they never saw any electric vehicle, like a locomotive, like a train or other engine-driven machines. All they had was horses and cows and wagons. So the guy from Keilim comes to the big city and suddenly sees a steam engine. He sees a train, and he sees it's moving, and he can't figure it out. Then he comes running back to his town and says, "Hey, I saw something. I saw a vehicle that's moving without a horse in front of it pulling it." So they asked him, "So what made it move?" He said, "There's a vehicle behind it that was pushing it." And they said, "And what about that vehicle?" He said, "Well, there was another vehicle behind that one pushing it. And then 10 vehicles, 20 vehicles. I don't know how many cars this train had." They said, "And what about the last vehicle? Who pushed the last vehicle?" He says, "I forgot to ask." Because that was his concept, that the only way a vehicle could move is something pushes it. You know, if you see something moving suddenly that doesn't have any power of its own, you have to say something's pushing it or pulling it. But the truth is that when you come to realize, I'm just using it as an example, there's another way of getting movement to go. So you ultimately come to realize, like those old nursery school books, you know, the earth rests on the back of a turtle, that stands on the back of a elephant, that stands, I don't know, on top of a whale. I don't even remember. Or like we go back and scientifically to the Big Bang. And then when you ask the question, so what was there before the Big Bang? A ball of gas. And what created that ball of gas? Where'd that come from? So at some point, any scientist is going to tell you, now you're entering into the world of metaphysics. I can explain to you things from when we know and understand how they started evolving. But before that, I can't tell you. We don't have any empirical or any other way of extrapolating and figuring it out. Now, so if someone says it's God, you can't say that's incorrect because you don't have a better answer. Point being is that what the Rambam is saying, Chassidus, of course, elaborates, is that you come to a conclusion that reality is not reality. Not the physical reality, not the spiritual reality, not the highest levels of revelation. It's really coming to understand a reality that is absolute from within and is not generated by anything else. I'll tell you, when I first learned this, and I remember it very vividly, when I was I guess 17 maybe, when I first appreciated it, I should say. Now when I heard the words, when I understood it, I came to realize something psychological. I realized that all the insecurities and all the fears and all the things that create uncertainty in our lives is because we know and realize that life is not absolute. People die, there's illness, there's unpredictable events. You never know when a curveball is going to come your way. And then there's all the insecurities that we develop through our childhood and through our adulthood, the distrust, the disappointments, the deception, the duplicity, and so on. And I really came to when I said, wow, there's an entity in reality somewhere that's not subject to anything else, affirming it or validating it. It's real because it's real. If you can connect to that, you connect ultimately to the ultimate root and source of all security. Because nothing is as secure as Atzmus. Everything else is dependent on something. So it's true, Oir is a very high level. And it's high because Atzmus gave it that power. So if you can connect to that rock, I'm using that word, that is so-called eternal rock, or eternity of Metzias built in Metzias Nimtza, and Metzias Atzmusa that we're learning, that ultimately is not dependent on anything. Everything else needs the validation or even the creation. Parents, children need parents. We need their validation. We need love and so on. So it's really giving us a source of ultimate security and confidence because you're connecting to something that's not dependent on anything or anyone, which then you can understand a little why the Baal Shem Tov on his father's deathbed, and his father told him as a little child, he says, remember, don't be afraid of anything but God. So nothing frightened him, not people, not PR, not image, not how people look at him or not. Because when you do, in a real way, connect to that, you are literally indestructible, meaning indestructible in spirit, because you're connected to something that's not subject to anything else, where everything else in existence is subject to something, even as he says here, the highest levels of Oir and Gilui.
It should be introduced early, very early to people learning about God, Torah, or anything.
Absolutely, I
Maybe
totally
all
agree.
civilization, maybe not even only Jews, everybody.
I
Totally.
totally agree, because if you have this in your life in a healthy way, this type of a connection, like you really have the secret to achieving anything without fear. Bottom line is, things that are dependent on something else have, I don't want to use the word fear as in like trembling fear, but they cannot be absolutely guaranteed of anything because they are dependent on something that gives them existence, gives them
And
validity.
the one thing that humans want more than anything else is certainty. And, like assurance, certainty, I believe. We don't have, everything is very random, it seems, in our lives. And I think the best part of what you're saying, not the best, but that this is the one way to refute the whole scientific notion of, what is God? You can't, we don't have the terms.
Well, let's.
I don't hear anything. Does everybody agree with that? Just me again.
Yep, I don't either. I think you froze.
Yeah. Same here.
Same here.
Should we try to sign in again, or what do you suggest?
I think he'll come back. We'll wait a few minutes. I don't know. I think he's going to come back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Rabbi.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
You just
Now we
came back,
can.
but there was
Yeah. You've gone for
a
about
break.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
You can't? What? I'm saying the internet must have gone down?
Everybody else was able to hear each other, but you froze for a while and then disappeared.
Okay, so the last thing you heard from me was when I know you were speaking, Robin, about uncertainty and so on, right? And science.
Yes. And then you started to talk about it, and that's when you
yeah,
froze.
okay, so God, but till that point you heard me, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I was going to say I always found it ironic that Prudential call themselves the Rock, and that in financial world they call it securities. There's nothing more insecure than money, but they call it securities because they're creating the illusion, as long as you're here on this earth, have a secure financial life. I know what their point is, but it's interesting to me. I always looked at it as saying, one second, this is secure. If you depend on your security purely on how much money you have and in your investments and retirement, you're not, this is not like I wouldn't call that like what we're calling here, chai be'etzem, real security. Anyway, just
Right.
for contrast purposes.
It's not bulletproof for sure.
Bulletproof
They should
is
have
mildly
a,
putting it.
Yeah.
You
right.
can't take your money with you after this world. Let's put it
Oh,
that
no,
way.
totally. No, but I'm saying when you're here, giving people
Oh,
the
yeah,
illusion
even when
that-
you're here, it's not bullet. That we
yeah,
understand.
that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, not to sound morbid, a lot of the funeral homes, when you see their advertisements, they say, guarantee yourself eternal future. And they show you a frolicking greenery of where, burial plots, basically. So we have a third alternative. It's called connecting to Atzmus, to the ultimate source of life and so on. Okay, being that we're already at 10:30, I'm going to stop here, finish the parentheses, and next class we'll go back to going to continue discussing what do we do with this fact? Once we know that Atzmus is the source of truth, absolute truth and absolute life, what does that do for us? That's what he's going to explain next, which is, I already mentioned it creates that security, but also that we want to connect to that. That's what ultimate connection is, to have be part of that reality. That's what we're going to continue learning, which is all what happens as the soul comes down below and comes to these high levels of awareness. So ironically, or paradoxically, the higher spiritual worlds, you don't come to relate to Atzmus quite like this, because you're essentially, I don't want to say spoiled, but when you're basking in the glory and experiencing divine pleasure, you don't have any thirst and there's no lack of anything. You don't come to realize what Atzmus really is like. It's specifically down here below, is with essential theme what he's saying here. Okay, so we'll stop here, middle of page 1461. Yeah.
If you could package this in some very succinct, I mean, this is such a life-changing concept for people to know. Like, I don't know how you would do it, but I mean, this is really at the crux of everything, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I try to do it in many of my classes, sometimes more explicitly than others, but yeah, this is the point. I totally agree.
I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying this is the thing that applies to everything, every other thing. You go into detail on certain aspects of, our spiritual or emotional lives. But if you start from this place, then everything else, kind of falls away. I mean, you don't have to worry.
Yeah, and the question is how to create an application and a modality of how to integrate this into your daily life. Because at the end of the day, even when we know this, today, I am sure all of us will be affected by others. and our fears don't just disappear. So how do you internalize this to the point that you really can live with it?
Is he going to tell us?
Well, he's telling us, and he will tell us, and I'll try to explain as best as I can.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi.
But then there's still work to be done. It's not no magic pill,